Mr. President, a great deal of conversation these past several days here on the floor of the Senate regarding cybersecurity. I think there's absolutely no question but that we would all agree that cybersecurity is a critical issue. I'm sure that every member of this body shares the concern that our nation is vulnerable, very vulnerable to cyber attacks, and those attacks could have severe economic and national security ramifications. We saw just this week over 180 amendments filed to the cyber legislation. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of us have ideas on how best to protect our critical infrastructure. And I think that's just one of the reasons that I was disappointed that the amendment tree was filled and cloture was filed on the cyber measure. I don't think that was the process that we were promised when the Senate overwhelmingly agreed to consider the cybersecurity bill. And because members were denied the opportunity to have a thoughtful and a complete debate that this very important issue deserves, the cloture vote failed this morning on a bipartisan basis. Now, we have heard a lot about the electric grid during this debate and how legislation is needed to protect our nation's transmission system from cyber attack. But what has perhaps been missing from this debate and this discussion is a recognition that Congress has already moved to protect our grid system, and they did so 7 years ago. They enacted the Bipartisan Energy Policy Act of 2005. Now, I'm the ranking member on the Committee of Jurisdiction, and I would just reassure my colleagues that we already have mandatory cybersecurity standards in place for our electric grid. In the 2005 Energy Policy Act, Congress directed the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC, which is the grid's regulator, Congress directed them to set mandatory, enforceable reliability standards, including standards for cybersecurity. And because these standards can be very technical, extremely complex, Congress decided that they should be developed through a consensus-driven stakeholder process that is overseen by the Electric Reliability Organization, an organization that we call NERC. And we thought that this was so important back in 2005 that we even expanded FERC's traditional jurisdiction to include municipal and cooperatively owned utility systems under these grid reliability standards. Now, it might surprise some to learn that the FERC-NERC mandatory cybersecurity regime currently regulates over 1,900 different entities, and that the electric power sector is already subject to federal penalties. And these penalties are serious, up to $1 million per day for noncompliance. So there is teeth attached to these standards. In fact, one of our own government entities, the Southwestern Power Administration, was recently fined by the grid regulators for violating 2 mandatory cyber standards. Now, the point here is that the power sector, the electric power sector, and our grid regulators have been working extremely hard these past 7 years to develop and to implement these cyber standards. We've already taken substantial measures to safeguard our electric utility systems. We've identified our critical assets and established security management controls. Risk assessments have been performed, personnel trained. They've established sabotage reporting, mandated disaster recovery plans. These are all processes and procedures that have been put in place. Now, it also might surprise some to learn that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, has already taken action to protect the nation's nuclear facilities from cyber attack. The nuclear industry developed a cybersecurity program for critical assets over a decade ago. The NRC now mandates cybersecurity plans for nuclear plants, including the identification of critical cyber assets and required contingency and incident response plans. And failure to comply with the NRC cyber requirements also can result in fines and even an order to shut down the nuclear reactors. So again, You've got standards that have been put in place with compliance requirements and penalties that are attached for failure to comply. Now, one concern was that the cyber bill was brought to the floor via Rule 14. And a concern with this was that it would undermine the existing mandatory framework that Congress has already established within the electric utility grid. And by establishing a competing regime, even if that regime was truly voluntary, the Cybersecurity Act that the Senate just rejected could duplicate, conflict with, and even supersede the hard work that's already been put in over these past several years to safeguard both our grid and our nuclear facilities. One of the amendments that I had filed to the bill that I had hoped we'd have an opportunity to discuss was a strong savings clause, a savings clause that would maintain the mandatory protections that are in place. Two competing systems are not workable and could in fact make the nation's grid and nuclear facilities even more vulnerable to cyber attack. Now, one thing that we've learned in the Energy Committee in overseeing our mandatory cyber practices is that not everything necessarily needs to rise to the level of a foundational standard. But with cyber threats and vulnerabilities that are constantly emerging and constantly changing, I think the one thing that we would agree is that we always need more information. I think we can also all agree that the federal government needs to form a partnership with the private sector. We share the same goals. Government and the private sector share the same goals: to keep our computer systems and our nation safe from cyber intrusions. We need the private companies to be talking with each other and with the government about the cyber problems that they face, as well as potential strategies and the solutions to combat them. And we also need our government to provide timely and actionable information to the private sector. It's got to go both ways. So as we go off to our respective states and discuss with our constituents back home the many issues that are out there, I would encourage members to take a look at what has been introduced by the ranking members, the Secure IT Cyber legislation. Take a look at what has been offered as an alternative. It's a common sense approach to addressing our ever-increasing cyber threats. Our bill focuses on 4 areas that we believe can reach bipartisan support and result in legislation that can get enacted even given the politics of an election year. The 4 areas that we focus on are information sharing, FISMA reform, criminal penalties, as well as additional research. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to close with just some observations very quickly about the process. Back in 2005, when the Senate passed the Bipartisan Energy Policy Act, it passed by a considerable margin. It was 85-12. But we spent a full 2 weeks on the floor considering amendments at that time. We had earlier spent 2 weeks marking the bill up in committee. So what I'd like to leave folks with is just the reminder that process really does matter. That's how strong bipartisan pieces of legislation are enacted. And when you forego that process, and you don't do that hard work in committee and send an ever-changing bill directly to the floor via Rule 14 and then fill the amendment tree, the legislation just doesn't work. It's bound to fail, and that's what we saw today. A few months ago, I came to the floor to advocate for cyber legislation and to express my concern that the all-or-nothing approach to cybersecurity could result in nothing. And after today's vote, that's really where we are. That's what we have. I do remain hopeful that we can find a path forward on the cyber issue that will result in a truly bipartisan and effective piece of legislation that will help our nation's critical infrastructure. With that, Mr. President, I see my colleague from Louisiana, and I will yield the floor.